Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks.
In this episode, I spoke with Pierce Salguero, Ph.D., about his new book, Buddhish, a guide to the 20 most important Buddhist ideas for the curious and skeptical, published this year by Beacon Press. Pierce is a professor of Asian history and religious studies at Pennsylvania State University and is editor-in-chief of the Asian Medicine Journal of the International Association for the Study of Traditional Asian Medicine. Pierce received his Ph.D. in the history of medicine at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, his master's of East Asian Studies at the University of Virginia. He's a transdisciplinary scholar who is fascinated by historical and contemporary intersections between Buddhism, medicine, and cross-cultural exchange. He really is a prolific scholar, has a fascinating background that includes a former career as a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine, along with having been a monastic for a few years in the Thai Buddhist Forest tradition. We had a fascinating discussion about his new book, Buddhish, and how he approaches this topic in ways that offer newcomers, both curious and skeptics, a way to get a tour bus ride of the vast terrain of Buddhist philosophical ideas and practices across various schools and traditions. I enjoyed my conversation with Pierce, and I think you will as well. Welcome, Pierce. So we have Pierce Salguero today on our podcast. So great to have you, Pierce.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. And we met American Academy of Religion, and since then you've come out with a new book called Buddhish, which we're going to talk about today. Buddhish, a guide to the 20 most important Buddhist ideas for the curious and skeptical, published this year by Beacon Press, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your book, and what I really enjoyed about it was I know you're an academic, and like myself, and so to be able to write about Buddhism from your own personal perspective and to do it in a way that's so accessible and honest and engaging is not something you often see coming from academics. And I just heard, I think a few days ago, I heard this, I don't know who said it, I can't remember, I was listening to another podcast. Someone said, easy reading is damn hard writing. and so maybe the flip side of that is hard reading, like academic writing, is easy writing. Maybe not. Most academics and scholars don't write like the way you do in this particular book. And so what was that like for you to shift gears? I think that might be a nice way to start out. I'm curious.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yeah, I think maybe I agree in some ways that academic writing is easier because it's hard to put sentences together and use the fancy words that we use in academic writing, and everything has to be properly footnoted and so forth. But you never really put yourself forward. You never are too vulnerable. So that's the part that comes pretty easily to me. And writing a book that was more based on, it has a lot of academic research behind it, but just also telling stories about my personal life and where I stand on Buddhism it is a little bit more vulnerable. So it is putting myself out there, like you're saying, in a way that academics don't usually do. But I had a lot of fun writing it, actually.
A real fun flavor to it.
Yeah. And I started out actually as an author before I became an academic. I had a couple of books that I wrote. They were also nonfiction guides to, it was a Thai massage and medicine practitioner. So there were guides to that kind of practice. Also nonfiction books that were non-academic. So this wasn't the first time that I did that, but this was definitely the most fun I had writing any book like that. So it could just float. And it was 20 short chapters, maybe 5 pages each, more or less. And I would often just sit down and write one, and it would just flow. I'd write one in session, of course, coming back and editing and so forth. But it just seemed to flow.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And so maybe a good place to begin is to tell us why you wrote this book and why the title Buddhish, not Buddhist.
Yeah. So I guess to take the second part of the question first, Buddhish, it's a joke that I make at the beginning of the book, which is I've spent the last 25 years studying Buddhism as an academic. I have in the past spent a lot of time doing meditation practice. And so I feel like I've been Buddhist adjacent for my whole adult life, and my career very much is focused on the tradition. But perhaps very briefly at the very beginning, when I first became exposed to Buddhism, called myself Buddhist, but I really haven't for the last 20 plus years. It was a way of both acknowledging the importance that Buddhism has played within my life in many different ways, while also not necessarily claiming to be Buddhist or even a representative of Buddhism. So throughout the book, make that point again and again, that I'm taking the voice of a neutral or objective observer of Buddhism, but also I'm a fan and also have a lot of personal experience. But I'm also a critic. And so I bring out some of the negative sides as well. And weaving it all together into this metaphor that I use throughout the book is this is like a tour of a city that you're visiting for the first time. And I'm going to show you all of the highlights, but also maybe some of the seedy side of the city and the not so pretty parts as well. And that I keep saying over and over again, I'm not Buddhist. I'm not here to convince the reader that they should be Buddhist. I'm not here to advocate that you believe anything or practice anything, but rather just learn about the tradition from this more intimate but objective and lighthearted perspective that I'm offering, and then make your own decision if it's something that you want to pursue or not. And I think the reason for writing the book is I think that's a fairly unusual stand to take when writing a book on Buddhism. At least in my experience, most of the books that I've read are either Dharma books written by Buddhists, or else they're these really dry academic analytical treatments of Buddhism that are pretty inaccessible for an average reader. And I was trying to produce something that could blend, that could bring the best of both of those worlds together into something that's readable and accessible.
Yeah, and I think maybe it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about your background for writing this book, both professionally and personally, because I think it has a lot of relevance to way of framing this book in particular.
So where to start? I guess I was always really interested in Asian religion and culture since I was a kid, and not specifically Buddhism until I was in college. And I graduated. I took a intro course in college, and then once I graduated, I decided that I really wanted to traveled to Southeast Asia. What started out as a scuba diving trip with a friend without a plan of what I would do after that turned into an extended 4.5-year period of time where I lived predominantly in Thailand, but also did a lot of traveling in India and other parts of Asia. And during that time, I really dove into the practice of Buddhism from two different directions, both quasi-Buddhist meditation retreats like Goenka centers that are modernist Buddhist and not necessarily traditional Thai Buddhism, but then also I spent time with a Thai monk with monasteries. And at the time I was training as a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine as well. And there was a lot of lived Buddhism taking place among the medical practitioners that I was engaging with there too. So a lot of the ritual side, healings and blessings and exorcisms and so forth that I learned as well. I spent several years being exposed to different forms of Buddhism in Thailand, and was also very interested in the history and the connections actually between Buddhism and medicine. Over time, I was living in Thailand and traveling to India, buying big trunks full of books every time I would go to India, and bringing those back to Thailand and just reading them, devouring them, and really wanting more and more of that kind of academic and historical information. And eventually I just came to a fork in the road where I realized that my destiny was not as a practitioner, but as a scholar. And there was a certain point where I decided to come back to the States, enroll in graduate school, and pursue the career as an academic.
And what is your field of study? What was your Ph.D. in?
Yeah, so I started with a master's degree in East Asian studies because I wasn't really sure what direction I wanted to go in. Study of the intersection between Buddhism and medicine, you can do it from a couple of different angles: anthropology, history, religious studies, etc. And it turned out, so I did that from 2001 to 2005. I was doing a master's degree part-time, and then in 2005 I transferred to the Johns Hopkins University Medical School and did a PhD program in the history of medicine, specifically focused on intersections between Buddhism and medicine in medieval China. And I got that PhD in 2010. And since that time, I've been focusing on both medieval China, but also Thailand to some extent, and also more recently looking at Buddhism and medicine in the United States.
So you're a historian then, in a sense, so, but in training
Yeah,
wise.
yeah, my PhD is in history. Some of the work that I do these days is more ethnographic, but yeah, my training, because my master's degree was interdisciplinary, I actually did my undergrad in anthropology. So I've always been interested in this topic, pretty flexible on the methodologies that I will draw on in order to study this topic. Um,
Hmm.
I guess I do think like a historian in some respects, foundationally, just thinking about change over time and social and cultural influences on the medicine. Those are like common themes in my approaches. But I really draw on all kinds of different academic fields, including literary studies and translation study,
Hmm.
ethnography, history. I've even done some documentary films recently.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the topic that fascinates me, and I enjoy the flexibility of my position that I have, where I can draw on a lot of different methods to explore that topic.
Let's explore the book then. Chapter one begins with the title Awakening, and given your background as a historian, your take on that is interesting because and based on historical research, that this whole veracity and legitimacy of the historical Buddha is up for questioning. That's not really something that's really grounded in empirical evidence. Is that fair, or I'm not up on that sort of historical research?
So that's not necessarily my research either. One of the things I was doing in the book is drawing on all kinds of research from across the field. And yeah, there's been quite a bit of scholarly investigation. People who work on Pali and Sanskrit Indian history have done quite a bit of investigation into the Buddhist tradition for many decades now. I think you find some scholars who will side on this, who will come down on the side of, well, there's inconclusive evidence, so we might as well believe the stories in the scriptures. And then you have other scholars who come down on the side of, well, there's inconclusive evidence, and there isn't a reason to believe the scriptures. I think the latter camp is larger, although there's some kind of loud voices in the former camp. My perspective as a historian, like I tried to get across in the chapter, is to first of all to acknowledge that for Buddhists, this story is taken as truth and has been understood to be a factual account. The Buddha was a prince who's sequestered in his palace, and he ran away and became the Buddha. That the details of the story have been treated as factual by Buddhists for millennia, and by most Buddhists, pretty much all Buddhists maybe today. But for me, in the book, I wanted to really start off with differentiation of how a scholar approaches these materials as opposed to how a practitioner does. And so I just really pointed to the fact that there isn't corroborating evidence of those details outside of the Buddhist tradition. And the details are actually written down quite late. So the sort of, the famous story of the Buddha that we're talking about is not found in the earliest texts. So I say in the book, there isn't, to my standards, there isn't enough evidence to say that this is factual, but that doesn't mean that this isn't a extremely important story. And so I
Right.
pivot from thinking about it as a historical document to thinking about it as a myth. And a myth meaning not just like a falsehood, but a
Right.
myth meaning a story that is invested with all kinds of meaning and all kinds of importance for millennia by all kinds of people, because it really speaks to some core truths about the human condition. Whether or not the Buddha was actually a prince and actually did this, that, or the other, the story is true in a mythic sense, that it really speaks on a very deep level to a level of, it speaks to the depths of humanity, I think. And it certainly speaks to me. And I wanted to write about how you can both appreciate that it may not be factual, but also really appreciate the story.
So its mythological significance is undisputable, but its historical veracity is still an open question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you go through quite a few concepts within Buddhism, or tenets, and one of them, the big one, of course, is suffering and dukkha. And you often hear people say that, or the platitude that sometimes Buddhism is interpreted as a very pessimistic religion, and that the noble truth is life is suffering. Is it that simple, or are we missing something there?
Wow, that's a huge topic, right?
I know. You tell a really good story in this chapter about a personal story of traveling back to Thailand after the big tsunami in 2004 to help with some of the relief efforts, and that sort of contextualized some of the points you were trying to make about how people were reacting and responding to this event.
Yeah. Yeah, I was saying that's such a huge topic because Buddhism is such a diverse tradition with so many different expressions and ideas and philosophical extrapolations and practices and different kind of cultural resonances all over the world with all sorts of suffering has been interpreted in all sorts of different ways by those Buddhist traditions historically. And then today, obviously, Western Buddhists are both inheriting that whole range of interpretations and also creating new ones that relate to our culture. So it's difficult to have like the Buddhist take on suffering or the Buddhist take on any concept. It's hard to.
And I think that's what your book does well, is that it won't go down that path. And in other words, you're really educating the reader that there is no monolithic Buddhism, and that it's very nuanced and it's very complex, and both in terms of geographically dispersed differences, historical differences. How many people, when they first come across Buddhism, they just think it's a very simple monolithic entity.
Yeah.
And so I think you really disabuse people of that quite quickly in the book.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the main sort of focal points of the book, because I find that, that most people encountering Buddhism for the first time do think of it as a monolithic entity. Yeah, so what the thing that I tend to do in the chapter is to take a concept and then show how it's been understood in a number of different ways in different cultures, different times and places, and so forth. And then I'll pick some kind of hook. It could be a personal story. It could be a scholar, it could be a text, it could be a parable from the canon or something like that. And then I'll use that as a way of exploring the concept. So it's both trying to give some breadth and then also give a specific example. So
in this chapter, there was one point you made that I think it would be worth amplifying, and it's that a lot of people that come into Buddhism have these curative fantasies about awakening or liberation from suffering. They come into it and they think that if I become awakened or enlightened, that I'm going to develop this kind of like these superpowers that will make me immune from sickness, old age, and death. And I'll become like a superhuman being. And it seems like what you've done in that chapter is to pain from suffering, that it's not like we suddenly are some sort of superhuman that won't undergo the pains of life and death.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with bringing up the example of the tsunami, just a particular example where there was this really catastrophic event that was extremely painful for millions and millions of people, Buddhists in particular, and just talking about some of the responses to that I saw, and really asking like whether or not a sort of stoic acceptance of dukkha is really something that appeals to the reader faced with a massive calamity like that, and what value is there in, like you said, separating out suffering from pain and examining that. And at the end of the day, I raise more questions than I answer in the book, in the chapter, because I, at the end of the chapter, just leave it to the reader to decide whether or not these ideas resonate, what they think about them, and what they might want to put into practice. Not claiming to that I have the answer or that Buddhism has the answers necessarily. I do want to say though, so I don't think I mentioned this in the chapter at all, but in the medieval Chinese context, which is where a lot of my research comes from, very much Buddhism is understood literally as a way of transforming yourself into a superhuman entity that will literally live forever and not become sick and so forth. And you definitely find literal interpretations of those claims as well as the sort of more metaphorical interpretations. And so even just that isn't so cut and dry that all Buddhists think like this. Or I'm just always cognizant of the very wide range of interpretations that different Buddhists across history and today have brought to even the most fundamental concept like dukkha. You can find this huge range of different ways that Buddhists have understood that concept and worked with it. And I guess that's like the take-home point for the book as a whole, is like these 20 ideas aren't necessarily ideas that are going to tell you black and white, here's what to do. They're more like 20 tools to think with. And so suffering, or dukkha, is a tool to think with, that Buddhists have thought with, and that Buddhists have come up with a lot of different interpretations and ideas by thinking with this concept of dukkha. And I'm presenting how that might be useful for the reader to explore as well.
I was going to ask you if you could share a little bit about this. A story in the book that is just really a bit humorous, but also a bit troubling too. And that's that story where you were at a Thai temple and there was a mother who was selling birds, and that was a way of making merit to let these birds free.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story? And I think
Yeah.
it related it a bit to karma, and I think that's a perfect example of what you're talking about,
Yeah.
just how complex and nuanced. You could take just this notion of karma and you think you know what it means and you think you know how to interpret it, but when you start looking at it, it becomes a labyrinth of complexity.
Yeah, definitely. So, by the way, I use this book in my Intro to Buddhism course for undergraduates at Penn State, and they love this story, this
Oh,
chapter.
do they? Yeah.
This chapter it provokes some really strong feelings, and we have a debate in class over it. Yeah, so the story is, and anybody who's been around Buddhist temples in Asia will immediately know what I'm talking about. It might be fish, it might be turtles, it might be other animals, but in this particular case, it was birds that this woman was selling in small cages. And the idea was you bought the bird from her and you released the bird, and so you've gained some karmic merit by doing a good deed and releasing the bird. And then I said, I just later discovered that her son was then capturing birds behind, like down by behind the temple and putting them back into cages and bringing them back to his mom, so that there was a sort of a cycle of entrapping the birds and releasing them and entrapping them and releasing them. And so yeah, like you said, I use this as an opportunity to think about karma. And again, the idea being not that there's black and white rules about what to do in any situation, but how thinking about karma, karmic merit can be a tool that you bring to bear in an analysis of a situation of what is the right thing to do in this case. On first glance, releasing the birds is meritorious. Once you find out that the kid in the back is recapturing them, then you might question, by paying for the bird, I'm supporting sort of an industry that captures birds. And so maybe the right thing to do is not to participate. But then if you think about it at another level, then by not participating, then, here I am, by virtue of being from the US, I'm a wealthy person in this developing nation, and I'm able to support this woman quite easily because she's asking for 20 baht or whatever, and it's nothing to me. So to not pay, then am I harming them? Am I not being as generous as I could be towards them? So maybe I should pay. Then I'm like, maybe I should just buy all the birds and send them home for the day, like they can take the rest of the day off. But then if I do that, won't they be back with their cousins and aunts and uncles the next day, because everybody heard how you could make a lot of money from the tourists at the temple? So what I'm illustrating there is just like a simple example of how thinking with karma can be an iterative process where you go through and consider it deeper and deeper levels. And I made the point, like, this is a simple example, but like, how about things like the environment or war or politics or human rights or any other kind of issue that's much more complex, and where figuring out the right thing in a particular situation on first glance might seem really easy, but the more you think about it, the more complex it gets. And that karma doesn't tell you, okay, therefore do this. An easy read of karma might be like that, but if you actually apply karma as a tool for thinking, then it doesn't just tell you what to do, but rather it's a process. It's a process of engaging with ethical thinking in a much deeper way.
And there's very strong opinions, and depending on who you're talking to, too, because some Buddhist will be very adamant that you have to be a vegan. You're not a Buddhist unless you're a vegan. And then you look at Tibetans or even the Dalai Lama that eats meat, and especially in the Tibetan plateau, they don't have much choice but to eat meat. So it seems almost like we have to bring in something like complexity theory or something to make sense of this.
Yeah. And sure, other people Buddhists reading this book will have already an idea about where they come down on these issues. But for somebody who's not a Buddhist, particularly somebody who may have grown up in the Judeo-Christian kind of context where morality is sometimes treated as like more black and white, kind of dictates from God or so forth, I really wanted to highlight how karma really comes down to intention, and it really comes down to really like thinking through all of these layers of how your actions are affecting other beings and what the kind of ripple effect is of everything that you do. And that, so anyway, it was a way of, I think, also drawing attention to that contrast too.
Yeah. Yeah, you talk a little bit about, maybe we'll talk about this in a bit, but that you were a resident layperson in the Thai forest tradition. You were there quite some time. And the reason I bring that up is that as I'm reading your book, especially for someone like you said, who is not a Buddhist, and they're looking at the landscape, and it seems one option is I need to go to Thailand and fully immerse myself or become a monastic, fully detached as a renunciate. That's one real extreme. Or on the other extreme, you're a coffee table Buddhist or a mindfulness practitioner. And what's your sense of this sort of spectrum? I don't really know the question I'm asking you per se, but it seems like you've declared you're not a Buddhist, but for someone who wants to be a Buddhist, and that's a question we'll ask at the end, I think, like, why would you even want to say that you're a Buddhist? We'll get to that, but what do you think about this, where we're at in terms of people who are struggling, let's say Westerners, that want to move towards a deeper kind of engagement with the tradition? And what are their options besides these two extremes? What's your sense of that?
Yeah. We can come back to the chapter towards the end of the book that's called Buddhist, that is very much about like identity and the range of different people that call themselves Buddhist and why they do that and what they might gain from it and why that might be culturally specific or problematic. But to take the question like in the direction of somebody who's starting out to become interested in this, they're becoming interested in the tradition, want to deepen into it, but don't really know where to start. I think that is who this book is written for as well. You know, it's for the curious and the skeptical. So that would be the curious person who's maybe has a mindfulness practice, starting to learn that this originates somehow in Buddhism and wants to know more about Buddhism, or they have just heard about it and always been curious what it might have to offer, but haven't really found the right kind of entry point. One entry point, of course, is to go to a temple, hook into a Buddhist organization. You can find Buddhist podcasts and YouTubes and find Buddhists teaching Dharma on some of the meditation apps that are out there and so forth. So there's plenty of different ways for people to dive in, books obviously as well. But I think the problem that faces somebody who's in that position is the kind of blind man and the elephant sort of situation where Buddhism is so diverse and so huge of a topic. And you as a beginner, without knowing the whole landscape, you might choose to dive in, but you're just diving into, and you might not even realize it, but you're just diving into one very specific iteration of Buddhism based on the book you happen to pick up or the lecture you happen to go to, and then might maybe think that's the whole thing. So you happen to go to a Tibetan, you picked up a book by a Tibetan Gelug author, or you picked up a book by a Theravada Vipassana teacher, and now you have a completely different experience of what it is about. And so my book, in some ways, what I say this explicitly in there, and I hope it's something that comes across, but what I'm really trying to do is give people, like I said earlier on, it's like the hop on, hop off tour of the city. Here's all the stuff. Obviously, you can't introduce everything, but I really make an effort to just introduce such a wide range of different stuff, from meditation to core concepts like we were just talking about, karma and dukkha and so forth, to rituals, to healing practices, to deities, to philosophy, to just everything that I could think of woven together in some way throughout the chapters in order to really impress on the reader like the whole picture, and then give them some keywords to look up and some further readings to look into if they want to explore more. But I really do feel like, yeah, if you want to go explore Paris, you could just take a plane to Paris and get off the taxi and investigate whatever neighborhood you happen to be in, or you can read the guidebook and understand everything there is to offer in Paris, and then choose in an informed way where you want to look deeper. Yeah, so I'm hoping that the book serves that purpose for people who are interested in taking their engagement with Buddhism to a deeper level, and give them some starting points and some entries for doing that, but without actually pressuring them to do that, because it's entirely possible you read the book and come away with, okay, that was interesting, but I'm actually not interested in Buddhism anymore. That was enough. And I got my answers from the book, and the answer is no. And the way that I write the book is very agnostic on that point. Whether or not you're going to engage with Buddhism in the end is up to you. And I finish with sort of reference to the column and the whole have doubt and don't take things on the authority of other people, but experience it for yourself. So that's the take-home message at the end.
And another popular sort of image of Buddhism, obviously, is of the Oriental monks sitting in a lotus posture meditating. And Buddhism in the West has often been equated to meditation. And so I guess my question, and you do address it in different ways, that do you think that a Buddhist can move towards awakening only by meditating? Or maybe another part of that question might be, where do you come down on this in terms of the need for study or for thinking things through based on a study of classical or traditional text or commentaries versus just sit, just meditate?
Yeah, I guess my feelings, that's more of a Dharma question. So
Yeah.
I don't feel qualified to answer that. So I guess I'll talk about that other chapter on identities now. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is just how calling oneself Buddhist means so many different things to different people. And I think it's in that chapter where I talk about how so few Asian Buddhists, even today, never mind historically, have really engaged seriously in meditation. It's not what being a Buddhist means for lay people in most Asian Buddhist communities. Being Buddhist means going and doing the rituals. It means feeding the monks. It means earning merit. It means doing the chanting and so on and so forth, and may or may not involve meditation at all. And who are we to say that's not being a Buddhist? And then there's people who, in Asia as well as in the US, who maybe only meditate and don't do anything else and call themselves a Buddhist. I know people who don't do very much meditation and they're vegetarian and they don't really go to temple either, but because they're vegetarian, they call themselves Buddhist. That's pretty common in Chinese speaking communities as well as among certain groups of Westerners too. And then I get into the more nefarious side of the ethnic cleansing that is taking place in Myanmar and the kind of monks that were leading that effort to displace the Rohingya people, mobilizing kind of a Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar, very much calling themselves Buddhists.
And then the Pure Land school that doesn't engage in meditation per se.
Absolutely. All kinds of Buddhists are out there.
Right.
And I guess in that chapter, what I say is I don't feel like I'm an observer. I'm describing, not prescribing who is and isn't a Buddhist. And so I don't feel it's my role to identify different groups of people and say, these are Buddhists and these people aren't. So as an academic author, I'm more neutral on that. And the intended reader of the book is somebody who's not already knowledgeable about Buddhism, who's not already committed to a Buddhist school or tradition or whatever. And they're certainly not qualified either to decide who and who isn't a Buddhist. As a beginner in entering into this field, I think you should also have an open-minded, sort of more descriptive rather than prescriptive approach, and just investigate, okay, what are all the kinds of Buddhism that are out here before deciding who is and isn't the proper Buddhist. So I guess that's my response to that question. I don't know if it's satisfactory, but...
Oh, yeah, no, I completely understand. And I guess my question goes a little deeper than, it's more like, why are people so adamant to begin with of needing to identify as being something or having to declare a religious identity? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, isn't that like a core aspect of building a self, is identifying?
Yeah, that's where my question was leading in a way, because it's almost ironic.
I guess another way to think about this is that, like I said, I teach undergrad students using this book. And for undergrad students, they're particularly in my class, the Intro to Buddhism class, it's typically freshmen, sometimes sophomores too. So these are 17 to 19-year-old kids for the most part. They've just left their homes, particularly post-pandemic. They've spent several years just like in their living rooms or in their bedrooms, engaging with people virtually, and they really haven't had the opportunities to explore the world and do the things that even normally teenagers would have had the ability to do just a couple of years before. And they're showing up in class, and I personally, this is just my own sort of pedagogical decision, I personally don't feel that deconstructing their identities and their sense of self is necessarily the most skillful thing to do at that moment.
Oh,
And I
yeah,
think
for
at that
sure.
particular age, and particularly like this current 17 to 19-year-olds right now, I feel like helping them to explore meaningfulness and to explore different possibilities and to learn about those possibilities and perhaps even take on those identities and give them the information that they would need in order to navigate that. I think that's more important for them at this point in their lives than to work on deconstructing further what little identities they've been able to build at this point. For me anyway, I feel like the message of non-self that is or deconstructing identities that's central to Buddhism is more or less skillful in different times and places. And so I can totally see the value for some people, the need for some people to really explore a new identity and take on a new identity in order to really build up a healthy sense of self and a healthy psychology.
You know what? That leads me right into another question I forgot to ask you, and I know that you've done a lot of work in this area too. Is this a lot of people? I've seen this in a number of people that they don't know much about Buddhism or meditation, and they'll sign up for a 10-day silent retreat right off the bat. And some people do well, some people don't. And talk about whether that's skillful or not for some people. You've researched a lot about the maladies of meditation and meditation sickness, and maybe this is a good segue to talk a little bit about the work you're doing on Buddhist medicine and healing. And
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this topic is mentioned very briefly in the book, but I didn't get into it in a lot of detail. But it is the subject of what's being called in the scientific community the adverse effects, meditation-related adverse effects, or what in the Sino-Japanese tradition was referred to as meditation sickness. So Chanbing or Zenbyo. Zen sickness, Chan sickness, meditation sickness. In Tibetan tradition, it's referred to as lung, meaning wind disorders. There's also materials on this from Southeast Asia. In Thai, it's called lum. So very well-known phenomena, very well documented all over the Buddhist world in all of those languages and others. There's historical texts, there's contemporary texts. I haven't done an ethnographic study of interviewing in a formal way contemporary practitioners in Asia about this, but every time I've raised the question with an Asian monastic, they have always told me that this is something that is well known within their monastic communities and that they have different practices and different kinds of healing techniques that are known among the community for treatments. I happen to know, because I work on China, and I happen to know the Chinese medical tradition actually, for at least since the Ming, 400 or 500 years, has had therapies within the medical tradition for how to deal with monastics who have these issues as well. Tibetan doctors also in the practice of Sowa Ripa have a range of different therapies that they apply. So this is it's a very well documented phenomenon in Asian Buddhism that seems to also have been known in the Anglosphere in the West, in the English speaking sanghas, although perhaps not communicated, perhaps not getting nearly the amount of press that the benefits of meditation have gotten in the popular media. And so it seems to be this topic that is in recent couple of years seems to be emerging more and more into the public consciousness. I think it's a real thing. Meditation, particularly very intensive meditation retreats, I think we can definitively say that they're not for everyone, and that people should be, I personally think people should be made aware of the potential for these kinds of pretty severe, sometimes very severe adverse effects. What I'm hoping to do in my research now is to bring to light some of the Asian materials and be able to bring those out in translation and talk about what they contain and what kinds of diagnostic tools and what kinds of remedies or interventions they contain. So as a historian myself, my eyes are more focused on the historical texts, but I do know anthropologists that are also working on this issue by doing ethnographic interviews with practitioners today.
what are some of the titles that you've published recently on this? There have been a number of volumes that you've published.
Yeah, so my larger academic work has been on sort of the intersections between Buddhism and medicine, like I was saying earlier. And so it's not specifically on meditation sickness, but meditation sickness has been a minor theme in that material. So I think people that are interested in the project more broadly could probably look at my most recent publication, it's called The Global History of Buddhism and Medicine. And it just came out this year from Columbia University Press. And that book it's available in paperback, which is rare for academic books coming out for the first time. I negotiated that because it's also a book that I wrote with the intention of being more accessible to a wider audience. So it's meant to be a book that meditators or Dharma teachers or just interested parties could pick up and read. You don't have to have a PhD to make sense of it. And it's a broad summary of the global history of the relationships between different forms of Buddhism and medicine over time, starting from the 2,400 years ago to the present. So it's a very kind of broad brush kind of overview it goes through early Buddhism, Mahayana, Vajrayana, sort of philosophical question, historical movements of these ideas, lists all the texts that are available in English, and continues on to the present, talking about how these traditions continue today. Meditation sickness is a small part of that overall project, but what I'm doing now is bringing out some of the historical texts that relate to meditation sickness in English translation and starting to...
Wow, that's fantastic. And you studied traditional Thai medicine yourself, right?
Yeah, before I became an academic, I briefly was a practitioner of traditional Thai medicine. That's where I got interested in this intersection between Buddhism and medicine. Because at the monastery, I spent a little bit of time as a resident layperson for a couple months in the summer. I saw the monks doing traditional medicine, herbal medicine, saunas, massage, things like that. And then when I was learning in the medical settings with both kind of medical schools, but also individual apprenticeships with practitioners, there was a lot of ritual practice, a lot of, like I said earlier, I think blessings and exorcisms and so forth. And so I just saw, for me, right from the beginning, Buddhism and medicine were completely intertwined. And so that became the launching off point for this career that I've had now, investigating those intersections.
It's fascinating and scary, just your vast grasp of so many interdisciplinary.
I'm a breadth thinker for tying together like large bodies of literature and looking at like vast landscapes and seeing patterns.
Yeah, I got that sense.
But I don't have the depth. Some scholars just really focus on the depth and they just go like deep into a particular corner. I did a little bit of that for my PhD, but I'm much happier like roaming in broader pastures. So there's a famous essay about the hedgehog and the fox. I don't know if you know this one, but the fox trots around with its head up looking for prey across the meadow, while the hedgehog is just digging in its little burrow. So if we translate that to like styles of scholarship, I'm much more of a fox than a hedgehog.
Well, that's great. Well, maybe we'll end on that note. And I really appreciate this interview with you and spending time with you today. And we'll have all these books that you've written on our show notes and everything so people can track them. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, fantastic, Ron. I really appreciate the conversation. And yeah, thanks for your interest in the books. And yeah, appreciate it.